Hey friends, I hope you all had tons of fun learning about all things Zeppelin from some of our users at Disney, Microsoft, and Amazon, just to name a few. But how does Zeppelin use Zeppelin? How do we use Zeppelin and other tools to build beautiful features like annotations and flows? So in this last session of the day, I'm super excited to share with you folks a backstage pass on how we use Zeppelin to organize our workspace and our components to deliver on the promise of design. Before we go into the meat and potatoes of this talk, let's take a moment to introduce ourselves. My name is June, and I'm a developer evangelist at Zeppelin. I'm also joined by Kundu, who is a product designer, and my partner in crime, Mike, who's also an evangelist. How about we start off with a fun little fact about us. Kundu, do you want to go ahead and kick things off?
Sure thing. Well, I'm actually really into webcomics. These are like your cutesy, digitally illustrated comics that you might find on everywhere on the internet today. But what makes them really unique to me is I find it amazing how they make a profound point using just a couple of frames and a couple of cute characters. I actually like some of these points so much. They're all up framed on the walls of my apartment.
That's awesome. And I'm Mike, an advocate, just like June, partner in crime. I was trying to think of an interesting fact for a really long time, and I couldn't come up with one. So I think that was an issue. I don't have anything like the comics, but I'm very, very into soccer. So anytime it's on, actually football is the technical term. Anytime it's on, I'm watching, I'm playing, I'm heading balls, I'm scoring goals, and that's what I love to do.
It's Manchester on the way, right?
That's the only team I don't want to offend anybody, but that's the only team I don't like.
Okay. Well, last but not least, my favorite thing I have in the world is I have this weird obsession with sneakers. I love them primarily because they're really comfortable, and I feel like, comfort is the most important thing in life, right? And secondly, I feel like it's kind of like a time machine. It brings you back to a certain point in your life that's memorable. But thanks for sharing that, folks. To kick things off, though, Kundu, can you share like a high-level workflow of how we actually develop features at Zeppelin?
Mm-hmm. Well, this can vary greatly depending on what feature we're talking about, but almost always we like to get started with some initial research and data just so we know our product needs, the user needs, what the product requirements are. If we don't have this, we would go out and do some research or analyze some data to get there. But once we really have these requirements defined, we would then do some scoping, figure out some timelines, maybe even make design requirements, just so we know what resources that might need. Now, after this point, from a design perspective, we would ideate a lot, we would do a lot of divergent thinking, try to think of many ways to solve the same user problem, iterate a lot on these, and eventually at some point we would start converging on one or a couple of those. At this point, we would do this process of creating sketches, wireframes, high-fidelity prototypes, and all this happens in design tools like Figma and Sketch here. Once we have some clarity on the designs, we still undergo further iteration. We try to collect feedback internally, externally, try to involve stakeholders from other crews. And once the designs are really finalized, eventually it goes off into the handoff process and continues along the design delivery route. All of this happens in Zeppelin, which is, of course, the core value of the product. And finally, before it's live, once we have the code ready, we do some testing. Could be internally, could be through betas. Shout out for you folks to join our betas.
I think what's interesting to me is that when you're in this iteration phase, it's like this world of possibilities, right? It's like you can go down like an infinite number of paths. You're like this explorer, and you're cutting through the jungle, right? Like trying to find that one screen that you're gonna build. But eventually, you have to narrow that down to one thing that you're going to deliver to your team, right? Yep. And iteration is huge today, even with tools like Figma that are popping up, right? Like the cycles that you go through, there's so many. So my question for you is just like, how do you narrow those down? How do you and the team go from this like infinite possibilities down to this like one single screen that you're delivering to the team?
Well, you are right. Design tools are a great place to ideate real time, just come up with a lot of ideas. But there are some issues there when trying to really converge to a couple of options. I think Zeppelin, more often than not, does a really good job at narrowing down from choices in the iterative process. It's really approachable and intuitive for folks that aren't from product design or engineering. An example that I can share here to communicate this is when I'm often working on landing pages for our website, I'm required to get some input, some feedback from stakeholders from the broader marketing crew. And instead of inviting them to the design file, having them go around the infinite canvas and then take feedback on what they think, I find it much easier to just upload the iterations and the different options to Zeppelin, organize them in a way where it's consumable, and then use our rich notes to collect feedback. Another neat thing Zeppelin does in sort of helping in narrowing down these options is that at Zeppelin we have versions at a screen level. So if there is a note asking me to make a change and I go ahead and update that screen, you can see it right at that screen level. You can just roll back on the iterations. It's very easy to see what has changed. Whereas in the design tool, that is rather tough to do. Either I have to manually do some archiving and copying, or you have to roll back entire files to just see what happened in the screen.
Yeah, design tools, I've worked with them in the past and they auto-save, right? So you need to like kind of roll back everything and then you get lost, and me as a developer, I don't really have an idea to how to work that process. But it's really interesting that you say that the iterative process is with the whole crew, right? So it's not just a designer, it's not just a developer, but it's with marketing, it may be with product, it may be with ops, maybe with other crew members to actually bring a product to life, right?
Yeah, design shouldn't really be done in silos. It should be cross-functional, collaborative. That way you get inputs from all the stakeholders that are relevant. Shouldn't be just one.
For sure. Yeah. So I guess just double click on that. How does everyone stay on the same page? Because there's tons of resources that's everywhere, right? Like we just don't use Zeppelin, we use other tools, right? How does that process look like for not just you, but with other members of our team?
Well, great point, June. It is tough to stay on top of all of these different floating bits and pieces that happen in documents across different tools online. There are a lot of conversations and decisions that happen, and it's really tough sometimes to really get to that information. And I could answer this question just by narrating a quick story. So back when I first joined, one of the projects I was supposed to work on was the Figma Plug-In. And a lot of the conversations and design decisions that happened for that plugin happened months before I even joined. So just to know what those decisions were and why the plugin looks the way it does today, what user problems were they solving that has resulted in the plugin looking the way it does. It's important for me to know this before I can maybe add or change something to the plugin. And these conversations are, as I mentioned earlier, are buried either somewhere else in some Dropbox paper file, in some Notion brief. Zeppelin does help with making this easier because it collects this information in a very accessible place right next to the designs. So, yeah.
Cool. Yeah, it's. I think it's interesting how like when you're working on a product, there's like Notion, there's Dropbox paper, there's like Figma, there's like FigJam, like there's like Storybook that has all your front-end component, your library, all your components there. But like you need all those pieces to like build a product, but they're all in these different places. And you were mentioning how when you're new, it's difficult to get that context, that historical context. So how do you and the team stay on the same page with like all these resources in all these different places?
Okay, so what's the problem at hand here? These documents are kind of everywhere. So the approach we take at Zeppelin is to at least bring this information or access to this information at one centralized location. And perhaps if you can quickly look at the screen that's open here, here is the Figma plugin section within our workspace. And right at a quick glance, you're able to see the crew that worked on it. So just in case I want to reach out to someone, I know who can answer this.
Yeah.
There's also links specific to the section itself. So we can see a link to the Jira board. And this shows you all open tasks and bugs that might have happened, even things that might have happened in the past. You can see links to Figma designs, to the style guides that are linked to the projects within the section. But for me, a really helpful thing when I was first looking at this was the project brief. So I'm looking at the designs, I'm trying to understand the context, and right from within Zeppelin, I'm able to go to the project brief and see, why are we doing this Figma plugin revamp? What's the important bit here? Turns out Figma is one of our fastest growing user bases, and there's a couple of initiatives there to support that growth. And that was really helpful for me to know, just to see how this work aligns with the broader vision of the company and where they're trying to head on the roadmap. Also, you can see links to Dropbox paper, where you can see user needs and research. And when I'm first looking at this, when I have no idea about what work has been done, it's great to just learn about these user stories. So let's talk about one. Let's say we have Jim, the designer.
Love Jim.
Jim's
Good guy.
great.
Good guy.
Jim's
Love
a
Jim.
wonderful person.
guy.
He is actually a good man.
Now, what Jim does is they use Figma and Zeppelin as a part of their daily workflow, to create a project, to maybe export designs to a project. Jim would have to move between the two applications, do some back and forth. You export the designs in Figma, you add commit messages in Zeppelin.
That's right, yeah.
And now with Figma really focusing on this browser-based workflow, we really wanted ways to sort of support Jim and make it easier for Jim to just export designs and be more efficient with their day-to-day process.
Of course.
So what the Figma plugin does now, and the project that I was supposed to work on, was to bring this export process within the plugin, so you don't even need to get out of your browser window. Way to go, Jim.
Yeah, that's a great story about Jim. Jim's a great guy. But before we move on, I just had a quick question here. With all these links on top, I see some from Figma. You mentioned Notion. There's Storybook. Obviously, we're not going to click into anything because trade secrets. But I just want to point out that when you have the show more link, you can pretty much link to anything, right? Like whether that be GitHub or Dropbox Paper or whatever else. I know in the past when I was a developer, I had 6 or 7 tools open. I had to press Alt-Tab to kind of toggle between all of them. Can you explain here to our friends a little bit about why this is easier for kind of people to pick up and run with it like you did?
All right. Well, what it does is it really surfaces up information that you might not be aware of. When you're just a designer trying to look around the design files, trying to look around the Zeppelin project, it's a great way to surface up information, resources, and conversations that happen elsewhere. Additionally, it's all centralized in one place, so I don't have to do a lot of back and forth conversations to get to this. It's right here and good to go. This is extremely helpful when trying to onboard, for example. If a new designer is joining a team, this is a great way for them to quickly understand what all the context that happened related to this project. You don't even have to be moving teams. You could perhaps even be just trying out or reading more about a new feature, and all the information is right here.
That's awesome.
Yeah, so collating these resources is super important when you're building product, right? And having easy access to them in one place where you and the whole team can go reference, that's key. And it sounded like when you're building this new Figma plugin, this really helped you specifically onboard into building that project. That's pretty cool. I want to now focus on something a little different. When you're building this Figma plugin, what were some of the other challenges that you faced? I know that Figma has its design language, right? And that can be a little bit different from what we have here at Zeppelin or what we're used to doing. So maybe could you talk about that a little bit, how the team solved using those different requirements?
Well, you are right, Mike. Figma does recommend...
As always.
They do recommend using their design system for the plugin, and that's also what we did here at Zeppelin. But what does a different design system really mean? It means different text styles, different colors, different components even, that are all unique to the Figma plugin, and that aren't what you would maybe use to develop Zeppelin's applications. So this poses some challenges in just making sure that everybody who's working on this is aligned, is aware, is familiar about the differences in the design system. So an approach that we took here is we created a global style guide for the Figma plugin. That way, all the important components and colors that are unique to the plugin are in that style guide.
So real quick, sorry to interrupt, but for our friends who don't know what global style guides means, what does that entail?
Well, global style guides are essentially just style guides, but they can be linked to any project in your workspace. You can define these text styles and colors and even components, and then inherit those into projects, and then they're good to go right from there.
So it's kind of like the base class.
Yeah, in a way, it's a great way. Let's say you have your own company's brand. You have certain colors that are defined, that are used across products, across platforms even. So this is a good use of global style guides to just define them globally and then inherit them in whatever style guide or project you might need to.
Got it. Yeah, so would love to kind of take a look at where the style guides places. So would you mind navigating over there?
Sure. So in this workspace section, you actually see that this entire section is connected to one style guide, which in this case is the Figma Plug-In style guide. You can have descriptions here in the style guide. They just help you align with what it is. You can link additional information. You can see what projects it's linked to. But specifically for the Figma plugin, all the unique colors and texts and even components are all right here.
Cool. Looks like you even have spacing tokens, right? Mm-hmm. It looks like you have a whole list of all these components here, right? Can you kind of go into how this thing works? Like, do you need to set this thing up in Zeppelin, or do you already set up in Figma, and then do you bring it over here? Like, how does that happen?
Well, for this project particularly, I used variants in Figma quite a bit to define components. Define states, like you can see here, the property is a fraction and the values are just different percentages. So this is all defined in Figma. Now what makes Zeppelin really amazing is that the exact properties and values that you define for variants in Figma are translated 1:1 right into Zeppelin. So I don't need to do any additional work to set these component variants up. They're already organized and good to go. This really helps me speak the same language with the developers. We're always on the same page when it comes to how these components work and what variants might be there.
Got it. So this is great because you have a spot for all your components. But as a developer, I'm selfishly asking, if I'm working on a particular screen, do I need to come back here? Oh, okay. So yeah, like how does that process work in terms of, do I need to go back to the style guide to look at all my component variants? Or is there a way that could be surfaced on a screen that I'm working on?
Well, let's actually dive in at the screen level and see what that experience might be.
Let's dive in.
Dive in deep.
So here's a screen from our Figma plugin. This is the project selection page. So this is where designers in Figma would choose a project in Zeppelin where they would like to publish their designs to. Now if you notice, this screen has one primary CTA. It's a big blue button that says export. Now as a developer, when you look at this screen, you might wonder, what are the different states that this button might take? How does it look when it's pressed? Is it ever disabled? And I often get notes like these from my developer friends.
Batman.
Classic.
Yeah.
Yep, just inquisitively asking me about whether I've thought of these states before. Lucky for them, in this case, since these were defined as component variants in Figma, Zeppelin brings them and they're all here to see. And a really neat way to look at this is if you click on the component variant and then you open the component variant window, you can sort of see the component but also the different properties and values that it has. In this particular case, you can see how it looks like when it's pressed, the normal default version, maybe even when it's disabled. This is a really nice way to quickly visually see what components states might be, different indications. Also, another thing, you can actually copy a link to the component variant that you might want to share right from within this window. So here, let me just copy that, go back to the note,
and share with the developer.
The Batman developer, of course.
Got it.
I think he's going to be happy about this.
He needs to hand that off to Robin.
Wow, that's actually really good.
And hey, check this out. A neat thing that Zeppelin does is when you paste a link that is referencing something within Zeppelin,
oh wow, it cleaned it all up.
It cleaned it all up and it tells you what that link is talking about, where that link is going to take you. You can do this for components, specific variants, but also screens, sections, and entire projects.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I really like the pop-out window. I love Batman, obviously. I'm actually a huge fan of Dark Knight. It's my favorite movie of all time. But it's cool how it also will take that big link and just show you exactly what that button is. I want to focus on how the designer and the developer will use this feature, though. I think for the dev, it's obvious. Like, you look at this screen and you get to see, like, there's my disabled, there's my pressed. You get to see all the states for your button, right? And that's super useful when you're building this screen because that button will have some properties and you need to build all those out. But you were telling me actually as a designer, this is pretty useful too. Because usually when you're designing, you'll have multiple screens, right? And each of these screens has a different kind of button on it. So it'd be that press, it'd be the disabled, the default. But in Zeppelin, you can see all those different types, all those different buttons directly on one screen. And you don't have to toggle the different states of the button to see that or change your design, right?
Yeah, that's really helpful, you know. as you said, sometimes I might have to showcase all these different states in different screens. It just bloats up the number of screens a project might have to communicate just the change of one component. So this way, the delivery process is organized, and I'm able to communicate still all the states of the button without really doing some additional overhead work.
Yeah, I think it's like the magic to me is that once you define it in Figma, like you bring it over, and like you said, like Zeppelin does all the magic. So as a designer, you don't have to do any extra lifting or nothing at all. You just have to export it to Zeppelin, and then Zeppelin like transforms for you for the developer or whoever else on your crew, right?
Yeah, you're right. And it oftentimes even helps with communicating design intent. If I have thought of it in Figma and it is attached to the component variant, it's already here in Zeppelin. I don't need to do any additional work. It even saves sometimes some back and forths with the developer where we might do some question answers on, do you have this component? Do you have this state? It's all right here if it's there in the Figma variant.
Pretty handy. Pretty handy.
Pretty easy too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, Kundu, thank you for joining us today. June, always a pleasure, my brother.
My partner in crime.
Partner in crime.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think we had an interesting, we went over some interesting things today. It was all about this Figma plugin that you were building, right? And initially it started with you not knowing with all these iterations and this infinite, universe of possibilities, narrowing that down into one thing, right? From there we talked about how you had all these disparate resources from Notion to Dropbox Paper to Storybook, right? And you collated those all in workspace sections, right? Finally, we talked about component variants. And I think what's interesting there for me is actually that there's a use case for designers and there's a use case for developers too. Like we actually kind of built that feature for devs, but like it's being used by you as a designer for something that we didn't necessarily intend. I think that's like kind of the beauty of Zeppelin, right? We build these stuff and people use it in so many different ways. So anyways, Kundu, thank you for joining. June, a pleasure. This is our last session of the day for our first user conference. We'll send it back to Elliot and Stephanie, and thank you so much.